Well, good day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is David Fortney, and it is my privilege today to chair and moderate a program featuring two of the most distinguished agency leaders that we have, and to provide an opportunity for us to get to meet them, get to know them a little better, and more importantly, to learn a little more about what their respective agencies are up to. A couple of things. I have some housekeeping points for those of you that are interested in CLE, and then I will turn to introducing our guests. First, materials for the program, and there are written materials for the program, can be found in the handout section on the website, and that can be accessed by clicking on what looks like a piece of paper in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Hopefully you'll see that. This should be at the top of your screen next to the question mark. So you click on that and you access the materials. In addition, the handout section is where you will fill out your CLE or continuing legal education form. And I want to note and thank, we have many people to thank for today's program, but I want to start with the Seyfarth Shaw for sponsoring the CLE credits that makes that part of the program possible. So thank you for our partner with Seyfarth for that. If you're interested in CLE credits, you'll need to do a little bit of work. You'll need to download the form, complete and return it to Seyfarth per the instruction, and the email is provided in the chat function. And the email, just so you know, is cle@seyfarth.com. You could also email it if you wish to Susan Wan at the college. I will provide you the CLE code that is required. We will do that later in the program, because we don't want anyone to cut and run on that. That's kind of an old trick we have for programs, so we're going to follow that protocol. And we will also share that in the chat box on the back end of the program. So that concludes the housekeeping. I also, just while thanking some of our partners, I do want to thank Susan Wan and the team at the college for helping to facilitate today. I want to also thank the staff and teams from both agencies, EEOC and OFCCP, who have been extremely responsive and cooperative and help make it possible today. And I want to note and thank Valerie Higgs on my team. All of these folks are critical, and honestly, we just wouldn't be in the little boxes you see on your screen today without them. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests. And I will start with Chair Burrows, Charlotte Burrows. Charlotte was designated by President Biden to serve as the chair of the EEOC on January 20th, which of course coincides with the day that he was sworn into office. She initially was nominated and confirmed as a commissioner of the EEOC in 2014, and then renominated in 2019. And Chair Burrows, and she was unanimously confirmed, I might add. So those that think you can't agree on things in Washington, here's an example where that's not true. She's currently serving her second term, and that term expires in 2023. A few more words about Chair Burrows, so you have a sense as to what her background is. She has broad-based experience and expertise, and is particularly interested in the impact of technology and big data on civil rights and employee privacy. But this is not Chair Burrows' first stint in the government or dealing with the policy issues that she deals with at the EEOC. She previously served as the Associate Deputy Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice. She worked on a broad range of both civil and criminal matters there, including racial profiling and implementing Violence Against Women Act, as well as other initiatives. Prior to that, and I think this is actually where I first had the privilege of meeting Chair Burrows, she served with Senator Kennedy, both on the Help Committee, which is where I first met her, and also as General Counsel for the Civil and Constitutional Rights Committee on Judiciary. So those terrific there. Judicial clerkship, I'm going to skip over the details. She did go to both college and law school, and those credentials are equally as impressive. Started at Princeton and has her JD from Yale. So, Chair Burrows, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So let me also introduce Director Yang, Jenny Yang, who again is a very well-known figure to many, if not everyone joining us today, as a fellow in the college. She also was appointed to her current position as Director of OFCCP. And I think, Jenny, you actually were there perhaps even within the first hour of the Biden administration.
Yes, I was. I've been told that's a record for OFCCP.
Yes, she was in the Francis Perkins building, so right away. But Jenny's position allows her to be appointed, and this position does not require Senate confirmation, so she could start her duties immediately, as she did. Of course, prior to that, from 2013 to 2018, Director Yang was both the chair, vice chair, and commissioner of the EEOC, and she also enjoyed unanimous Senate confirmation. So once again, proving that there can be consensus in Washington, at least when you have people with the qualifications and expertise that we have today. Director Yang has worked on a number of initiatives prior to her current role with OFCCP. I think everyone's very aware that she was very instrumental in EEOC's annual data collection to include reporting of pay data, and also on the select force on the study of harassment in the workplace, and has also been very involved in agency-wide technology and a host of other improvements and developments there. Of course, prior to her current stint, and in between the EEOC and OFCCP, Director Yang was a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. There, she focused on revitalizing anti-discrimination laws to better protect workers. She also was very involved in the working plan for a strategic partner with the Working Ideal Group. And prior to that, had spent a decade representing workers at Cohen Milstein, which I think is actually where I first had the privilege of meeting Director Yang at that time as counsel there. But her career also includes prior stints at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she worked in the Civil Rights Division. And prior to that, she began her career with the National Employment Law Project. Also a judicial clerkship, and her formal schooling credentials are equally as impressive. She's a graduate of the Cornell University and the NYU, New York University School of Law, where she also was a Root Tilden Public Interest Scholar. So, gosh, and I've given the thumbnail on both of our guests' bios, but they're darn impressive, and we're really, really appreciative. So I want to thank you both for being here. It's a privilege for us at the college, and I really want to take advantage now of the time and turn and have a little bit of a conversation with you both. What we thought we would do, and I should add for our participants, if you want to ask a question, put it in the chat box, the chat feature. Susan Wan will help gather those and assimilate those, and we'll either work them in or ask them at the end. Also, we're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end for sort of a Q&A period, but you don't need to wait until the end. If you have questions, we'll try to pick them up in live time, but also we will allow a formal Q&A period at the end. And because of the limitations of our platform, they will be through the chat function. I assume everyone at this point, after a year plus being virtual, is more than familiar with how to handle that piece of this exercise. All right, so let's dive right in. We have just rounded the first 100 days on the Biden administration. Of course, legally, there's nothing magic about the 100 days, but it has become a pretty well-established yardstick. I mean, there's a level of accountability, excitement, and initiative. And I know certainly President Biden has acknowledged the first 100 days and described many of the accomplishments that he has achieved and his administration has achieved generally. But I'd like to start with each of you to just describe what the 100 days has been like, kind of give me your highlight reel. Neither of you are neophytes, obviously, in leadership positions in the EEO agencies, but you're, like everyone else, neophytes in the Biden administration. So you've had over 100 days now. Let's talk about how that went. And let's see, Chair Burrows, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Director Yang on this one.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation and that really generous introduction, and to the college for inviting me, and of course to Susan, who has been so helpful, and I'm so grateful for her assistance as well. I have to say, it's just an absolute pleasure to be able to be with you and this distinguished group to talk about the Commission's work. So, and I have to say as well, I am just over the moon to be working together every day, but also in this program with Director Yang, so that we can talk about some of the exciting things that are underway in this administration. The first 100 days honestly felt like one very long day. You do drink from a fire hose in this, and so I am happy to delve in that. And again, David, I think you are the perfect person to moderate this because you have such deep experience in labor and employment issues, but also familiarity with DC and with our two agencies. So what I would say before I get started here is please, if I sound like I'm getting too inside baseball, you are the right person to bring me back on track because we're right around the lunch hour.
If you use too many acronyms, we'll fix that. Yeah.
So please do that. So let me tell you first the context that informs my vision for the Commission's work in this moment. So first, starting the first 100 days, the main thing that I have been thinking about and I wanted to share with you all today is that this is an enormously important time for civil rights, not just for the EEOC and the rest of the federal government, but also for our entire nation. And as we approach the 1-year anniversary of the really brutal murder of George Floyd, which will be, 1 year next week, our country is continuing to grapple with the very deep-seated racial inequality that is part of our national story. And this commission, which was founded in response to the 1963 March on Washington, really has a critical role to play in many of the urgent issues that are facing our nation, including systemic racial discrimination, but also the civil rights impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, systemic pay inequities, and of course, we are looking forward to really ramping up our implementation of the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Bostock v. Clayton County, which, as all of you know, affirmed protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so that also is coming up on a 1-year anniversary in a positive anniversary, thankfully, in June. So as always, we have a tremendous amount on our plate. But as I started this first 100 days, there were sort of two overarching and related goals. The first is to strengthen this institution and really to renew our focus on tools that allow us to combat systemic discrimination. So with respect to strengthening the agency, I've been strongly committed to ensuring that this commission has the resources and tools it needs to meet the challenges of this moment. And my goal in rebuilding the agency is that we will be effective not just now, but far into the future. The second overarching goal I mentioned is a greater focus on systemic approaches to combating discrimination. And if you think about each of those issues that I raised at the beginning, most of them really require that we, from a government perspective, think about broad-based approaches. And so that is true with respect to racial discrimination, but also to many of the other protected bases. The Biden administration has called for a whole of government approach to addressing systemic discrimination and advancing equal opportunity. And the EEOC has a critical role in that effort and a tremendous amount of excitement around that role. And so I think we're very well positioned to help lead in this area. And you can expect to see the agency continue to increase its use of systemic tools so that we can tackle those areas where there are broad patterns of discrimination, while of course also continuing to advance those individual charges, which are so important as well. And in doing this, I think we will be looking again at all bases. We have a number of issues on our plate, but remember, and I think that this is true for each of you, just a couple of years ago in 2017 and 2018, the issue of the day was harassment, sexual harassment, how to deal with those Me Too issues. Well, we were, under Director Yang's leadership when she was actually chairing the commission, we created a bipartisan, basically a broad-based bipartisan task force to look at that issue. So well before anyone was really focused on Harvey Weinstein or any of those issues in 2015. And we continue to have them front and center based on sex, but also harassment based on a number of other issues. So I would say that's the big picture. Significant accomplishments very quickly, because I know you all want to hear from Director Yang. Hiring, I mentioned strengthening the agency. That first and foremost means making the commission staff has what it's needed, and we have enough people to address expanding workload. And I've seen, even in the few years I've been on the commission, first as a commissioner, now as chair, that we have reduced the number of employees to shoulder that burden. So I need to take it back up. To be very concrete, in fiscal year 2020, our full-time staffing was at the lowest level in 4 decades. So in 1980, we had over 3,300 employees. It was down to less than 2,000 in 2020. So if you think about the expanding US population, our greater statutory authority, in 1980, we didn't have the ADA, for instance. We really needed to rebuild. So one of the first things I did as chair in the first 100 days was to authorize the hiring of over 450 new staff members throughout our agency. So investigators, mediators, attorneys, administrative staff, among other positions. And I'm hopeful that while that doesn't bring us back to exactly where we need to be, that we can continue to build. So that's the first thing. The second thing was to really focus on the pandemic and the civil rights issues that I know are front and center for most of you as well, and how we can most be helpful to you in that. So we held a hearing on April 28th to look broadly at those issues. And while I think that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, what was quite clear was that this pandemic has been not just an economic crisis and a public health crisis, but it's also been a civil rights crisis. So we talked about the economic fallout that disproportionately impacted people of color, women, older workers, those with disabilities, and many other vulnerable workers, and those serious implications for the workplace. And that requires, I think, a systemic and thoughtful response on behalf of the commission, and not just us, of course, but the federal government and the private and public sector. And I'm hopeful that that is exactly what you will be seeing. I think that the testimony from that hearing was extremely helpful to me. My colleagues have said that as well. So I really commend that to you. I believe that we will be sending around the link to the hearing. It's up on our website. And we had about a dozen experts on civil rights issues across the gamut. And that, I think, was really instructive for the commission, will help shape our work in this area going forward, and we could intend to continue to provide technical assistance to the public on that as well. So I will stop there, but as you can see, I'm very excited.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground, and we're going to come back and unpack some of those, but let me first turn to Director Yang, and Director Yang, I'd ask the same question. First 100 days, you're not a neophyte at leading an agency, but you are part of the new team at this administration. How did it go? What are you seeing, and what's coming up? Give me the big picture.
Well, thanks so much, David, for putting this program together, and to Chair Burrows, it is always a pleasure to be here with you. And thanks to everyone at the College of Labor Employment Lawyers for joining us today. It's been an honor for me to be at OFCCP during this critical time for our country, one where I do believe we have a potent opportunity to make real progress in advancing workplace equity. Our Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, is deeply committed to advancing racial equity. He made this a priority in his administration as mayor of Boston, where he also championed equal pay efforts. And he brings this commitment to DOL, and he has been a strong supporter of OFCCP's work. And as Chair Burrows mentioned, President Biden has made a historic commitment to advancing equity in a whole of government approach to ensure that underrepresented communities are included in our work. And what excites me about the role of OFCCP in this moment is the opportunity to work with federal contractors and subcontractors to ensure that our employment systems expand access to opportunity. Federal contractors employ about 20% of the American workforce, and the contractor community has a vital role to play in ensuring that all of America's workers are part of our recovery. Although OFCCP does receive and investigate complaints and has seen that number rise in recent years, the core of our work is not complaint-driven. Our focus is on compliance evaluations where we review policies and data and provide assistance to contractors on how they can strengthen their systems in a way that promotes equal opportunity. So through these evaluations, we can identify problems such as hiring and pay discrimination, which might otherwise go unaddressed through a complaint process because workers typically don't know why they weren't hired or what others are paid. So, and even when workers are aware of discrimination, the systems we currently have in place for raising complaints, from employers' internal grievance processes to the government's complaint filing systems, often create a real risk to workers of career-ending backlash or being branded as a troublemaker rather than someone who's trying to help strengthen the organization. And we saw this vividly with the Me Too movement, and we know that only a fraction, a very small fraction, of all problems are ever brought to the attention of the government. Both Chair Burrows and I have felt the urgency of this moment. As our nation recovers from the pandemic and employers rehire after historic job losses, we have a powerful opportunity to confront long-standing racial inequality. We have an opportunity that feels very different today than back when I was at the EEOC. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was thinking back to our preparations to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Title VII in 2014 and the EEOC's 50th anniversary the following year. And we were sitting around trying to think about how can we get people to understand that discrimination is still a problem in American workplaces. The fact that we had our country's first Black president didn't mean we had overcome the problem of discrimination. And what feels different today is that more people of all backgrounds are recognizing that there are inequities that are often built into our systems. And that includes how we hire, set pay, and select people for advancement. And as we see more employers stepping up to make strong commitments to racial equity, we have a real opportunity to shift the conversation and understand the kinds of systems and accountability that it will take to promote equity, because it will take all of us to address these problems. After leaving the EEOC, I worked as a fellow at the Urban Institute, as David mentioned, and I wanted to understand the evidence-based research on practices that work to advance equity, including preventing and responding to harassment. And I also worked with employers as a consultant to help them apply this research to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. And throughout my practice, I've been very interested in understanding the challenges on the ground that can keep well-intentioned efforts to promote equity from achieving their objectives. What I saw during my time as a litigator for over a decade and a half is that challenging systemic hiring, pay, and promotion problems, it can often be easier to identify the problem than to know how to fix it. What I learned at the EEOC is that the more we as regulators can understand the real world challenges faced by employers, the better we can advance equality of opportunity through our guidance and our enforcement. We have no interest in creating burdensome and unrealistic requirements for employers that consume resources for little benefit. At the same time, the government needs to be able to conduct sufficient oversight to provide safeguards for workers and create greater incentives for proactive compliance. Our goal is to help employers to direct their efforts on those initiatives that will make a difference. And what I've seen through the years is that we can align potential EO solutions with an organization's broader business objectives, such as reducing turnover or increasing employment engagement. And where we can do that, organizations can better engage their leadership at every level to embed these practices in the kinds of actions that create tangible progress. And so that's what's been on my mind. And I want to share 3 areas in particular that we've been focusing on in our first 100 days. So one of my top priorities since joining OFCCP is to rebuild. I've been engaging with our career leadership and staff across the country to identify opportunities to use our limited resources as strategically as possible to strengthen our enforcement, which has been fairly dormant, and to protect the rights of workers who have faced barriers to good jobs. So we are working to hire staff. We don't have the budget to hire as many as the EEOC at the moment, but we are working to do as much hiring as we can, particularly for our compliance officers this fiscal year. And that is a top priority for us next year as well, to hire for these key positions that will strengthen our enforcement. And we are assessing the kinds of position and skill sets that we need to increase our capacity and really use our particular authority, which well situates us to address systemic barriers to opportunity and to ensure that we have the kinds of knowledge, training, and skills within our staff to tackle some of the hard issues around compensation discrimination, as well as hiring discrimination, both which will continue to be a core feature of our agency's work. And another area that has been an important one for us during these first 100 days is the executive order that President Biden rescinded on his first day. This is the Trump-era Executive Order 13950, which was entitled Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping, which prohibited federal contractors, grantees, and the federal government from providing certain types of workplace training and diversity programs. So President Biden issued a day one executive order working to advance racial equity and support underserved communities. And this directed the government to revoke this executive order. And we took immediate action at OFCCP to do that. We have information on our website about that action. But we have shut down sort of that process. And in addition to that, I've also been working with Chair Burrows and the EEOC to better understand how diversity training can be used as part of a broader strategy to advance equity, right? We know from the work that EEOC did on harassment prevention through the task force that training alone is not going to solve the problem, right? But it can be an effective part of a broader strategy that looks at practices as well as culture. And so we've been engaging with researchers studying what works in diversity training, practitioners who are out there working with employers every day to understand how employers can use these efforts in a way that's likely to be most successful. Another area I wanted to highlight is that we are working to reinvigorate our construction enforcement. With President Biden calling on Congress to make historic investments in our nation's infrastructure, we have a very important role to ensure that federal contractors are providing access to all communities and allowing everyone to contribute in this vital work. So we have taken a number of steps, including creating a new centralized system to schedule construction contractors for compliance reviews and receiving authorization to schedule contractors for compliance checks, which is a type of compliance evaluation that ensures there are key records. And we are currently in an open public comment period on a proposal to collect payroll data and other records from construction contractors for review before we go on site to determine whether there are potential indicators of discrimination. So that public comment period does close tomorrow, May 19th, and we will be conducting education and outreach to the construction and stakeholder community as well as workers. So those are just some of the highlights from our first 100 days, and I look forward to talking more about them and working collaboratively with everyone here to bring together the breadth of experiences and perspectives in our virtual room today to help us solve some of the greatest employment equity challenges. Thank you.
Wow, terrific. Okay, so let's unpack a little bit of that because you both have identified increased resources and training and initiatives, and you both agencies do have charge-driven, not completely with OFCCP, they get to highlight who they may audit, but they also do receive charges, and that's a point that I want to make sure everyone's aware of because that's not sometimes as well known. Can I ask you both to unpack a little bit, sort of two topics that I heard that you both have now identified. One involves, I'll call it just broadly, the social trends, most of which have been very challenging. I don't mean COVID. We'll talk about the pandemic separately, but let's just talk about, you know, whether it's the murder of Mr. Floyd or the more recent Asian Pacific attacks that we've seen. The president has addressed this, but broadly, these societal points, because I think the notion, Director Yang, that you mentioned, that when you celebrated the 50th anniversary, when you then were at EEOC, sort of, you didn't say this, but that I will say myself, I sort of wonder, well, what is the future, and are we ever going to outgrow this concept that we need agencies such as yours? And I was mindful of Justice O'Connor's notion of affirmative action might end in 25 years. And so there are lots of predictions, but the more recent trends that you both identified in the last year particularly are very troubling and challenging. Can you, I'd like to understand a little more detail, if you can share with us, specifically the societal trends, social trends, how your agencies are responding. Do you see different charges? Is it focusing the initiatives? Are you cross-working with each other on some of those issues? Let's talk about that a little bit. Maybe Chair Burrows, I'll go to you for a quick answer, then I'll come back to Director Yang, but you two can, as they say, talk among yourselves. No, go ahead.
Okay, well, quick is, the very quick answer is yes. The more,
a little more than that.
The more detailed answer is obviously this is an extremely important issue that goes right to the heart of what this agency is about and why it was founded. And, you know, it's interesting because as you say that, and in listening to Director Yang, what's clear is that in a lot of ways, the EEOC is a bit like the canary in the coal mine. And I say that in very deliberately because while whether or not the rest of America is focused on these things, we see them because they are reflected in the charges coming in our door, not necessarily immediately, there's a delay, but just as it was clear to us in 2015 when that bipartisan task force on harassment was created, that there was a 5-alarm fire on harassment. And the rest of America took a couple of years to pick that up. But we literally had enough charges coming in the door that we could have decided we're only going to do harassment. No promotions, no firings, just harassment. And everybody would have been busy across the 53 offices. And so it takes a while sometimes for America to catch up. And sometimes, unfortunately, too often, it's an emergency. And that's what we've had. But this problem isn't new. The good news, and I am an optimist at heart, very sincerely, I believe this. There's no natural law that says this, we can't get over this problem, that it always has to be with us. The issue is, and that's why I think I am encouraged right now, we can't fix it till we face it. And that was true of harassment. The fact that there is now focus and that America is seeing what we unfortunately have had a front row seat to, is actually quite helpful, although it is jarring and difficult at the same time. So the short answer is yes, we are looking at that in a whole of government way, very happy to be working with OFCCP, working more broadly across that, and to really be thinking about solutions so that we don't just say, oh my goodness, and describe the problem, but also understanding that it doesn't have to be this way, trying to move the needle on those solutions as well. And I think that this is, as you mentioned, the horrific killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Adam Toledo, and so many other persons of color, children of color, really has woken folks up to this broader question of systemic discrimination and economic equality and equal employment opportunity that have always been there. So now that we face it, we can together fix it. It's not just a government issue. The same is true that I think that the rising discrimination and in many cases violence against Asian Americans has been, prompted, I think, and accelerated by this really misguided notion that somehow Asian American persons and Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians are responsible for COVID-19. But the truth is there are much deeper roots to that kind of hostility, and this shameful violence and xenophobia really has to be rejected in the strongest possible terms. And so I was very glad that after the mass shooting in Atlanta in March, the commission on a bipartisan basis came together and unanimously approved a resolution to do just that, condemn the violence, the harassment, and acts of bias, and to, on a bipartisan basis, unanimously make sure that the full weight of the commission is out there explaining that we all need to stand firm against this. I think that's more than just a symbolic thing. So it's too early to tell, but as Director Yang mentioned, we are looking, in addition to the ways in which we can answer some of those corporations that have made pledges in the wake of the really horrific murder of Mr. Floyd, and at other moments that they want to do more here and are finding that really some of the traditional approaches do not work because they focused really on hiring but didn't focus on retention, inclusion, equity, and those things that really give the benefit to the company from D&I. And so I have there's a lot more I could say about that, but I just wanted to give Director Yang a chance to get in here, and happy to answer any follow-up.
Sure. So those systemic issues particularly are fully in the wheelhouse of most OFCCP reviews. Director Yang, let's talk a little bit about kind of how you see your agency stepping in to more fully respond to these issues.
Sure. Well, I absolutely agree with Chair Burrows that the first step is acknowledging that you have a problem, and that can help create the will to marshal the resources and momentum to fix it. And that's what's been missing, right? I realized that at EEOC, I had somewhat of an epiphany that doesn't seem like much of an epiphany, but I was like, more people need to care about this issue. More people need to understand why it's important that it's a priority, right? And that's the opportunity that we have now. When I was back at the EEOC, we also struggled because, many employers were very uncomfortable taking a public position on race because it is a fractured topic that has kept us as a country from dealing with these long-standing issues. When you look at broad workplace surveys, many workers said they believe their employer was committed to gender equity, but that acknowledgement on racial equity was much lower. And so what I think we have now is the will, right, to be able to do something very hard and to acknowledge that there is something that we can do about it. One of my other key takeaways from EEOC is that occupational segregation, has persisted across race, gender, and ethnicity. And we have not made the kind of linear progress that I had, even myself being in this field, until I really dug in and looked at the EO1 data that EEOC collects. I hadn't realized how little progress we'd made since the 70s, right? And many of us, I think, have accepted that as inevitable. But what we've seen at the EEOC and also at OFCCP is that many of the inequities that we see are not simply a result of differences in education, geography, and choice, but also policies and practices of organizations. So practices like hiring primarily through social networks, or subjective evaluations of fit, or subjective resume review, or only hiring from elite universities that themselves do not reflect the diversity of America's talent, can all serve to replicate a current workforce and be a barrier to equal opportunity. So in our role as OFCCP, we are uniquely situated to look at these practices and to help employers who are federal contractors understand the ways in which they can begin to make greater progress in their efforts to expand opportunity through the kinds of recruiting, apprenticeship programs, and support and monitoring, really tracking the data and understanding at every point within your process, where might I have a problem? And having that courage to really ask those questions and to be willing to fix it, I think are where the solutions lie. So I'm very excited really to be working, in that kind of strategic way in partnership with the federal contractor community, so that the government can use its dollars in a way that really advances equity.
Those sound like pretty good tools for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which of course have really become very popular and widespread. And what we certainly hear from many employers is they want to move the needle, and they want to do so in a lawful manner. And I think Director Yang, that some of the tools you've just identified are extremely useful, whether you're a contractor or not, to help do that. So let's just talk briefly, Chair Burrows, on DE&I. Any specific add-ons or points that you'd like to make on that?
Well, I will say this. One of the things that we've been looking at, and I'm hearing so much from the companies, is that some of the thinking traditionally in this area had been about, it's, for lack of a way to say it better, sort of a numbers game. Yep. And so there are some companies that had fairly good, diversity at the sort of in the base of the pyramid, if you will, and sort of front entry jobs, maybe sort of even mid-level jobs. And then it stopped. But then when you looked, it was cycling through different people. So you'd do pretty well in the diversity hiring. Those folks would get disenchanted and leave after a couple of years, and then you'd hire again. So your numbers looked good, but you weren't growing a pipeline, and it wasn't actually giving much of a corporate benefit to the employer, an organizational benefit if it was an employer that was not in the private sector. And so really, I think that the main takeaway, and this is also helpful because I know a lot of employers are concerned about, well, I want to lean in on this, but I'm not entirely sure about at what point do I perhaps get into some legal questions about, am I leaning too far so that there might be Title VII issues or issues under other statutes. And really the key, I think, is to think about what is the business need, right? And for that, and to make sure that you hire. So for instance, if you need creativity is important to your profit and loss, and you're hiring from that, having diverse folks who can think about problems in different ways because they come from different demographics and different communities helps with not just actually getting what you need in the door in terms of talent, but also if there's question about whether or not that hiring decision was made for business reason, or perhaps there was some sort of unlawful motive, and that it was sheerly based on race or gender and nothing else, you have a really good explanation. So those things, I think, point in both directions, but also thinking carefully about, once you've figured that out, it naturally leads to inclusion and equity, right? Because you've hired for a particular purpose, and then you can be very intentional about making sure you get the full benefit of that. I mean, it is good business sense if you need creativity to have diverse views. It is good business sense if you have a diverse customer base and you need people who, literally speak the language of your customers or culturally speak their language, to have a diverse workforce as well. And so I think if it's thought through in that sort of intentional way about that, will naturally lead to things that the next step is, well, how do I retain? How do I make sure I include these folks so that I get the real bang for my buck, if you will, from having hired them in the first place. I think all of those things are not just important for the business side of, of being successful, but and retaining folks, but also for they, frankly, help if there's are legal questions about the rationale for doing it in the first place. So those would be the things that I'm thinking about, but just would say that, I'm not going to make any announcements now, but this is something where we do want to be helpful. We are hearing from, as you can imagine, and I'm sure you are too, a number of corporations across the country that are very interested in our help, and we would like to do our best to help figure out the best practices in this area, highlight innovative research and initiatives, and be responsive in that way. So we're ready and will remain part of the national discussion in this area.
Director Yang, anything you want to add on to that? You have the unique opportunity to look under the hood of thousands of employers, whether they want you to or not, every year. And
Sure. Well, I have been really heartened by the commitment we're seeing by federal contractors and many large employers in wanting to lead in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm interested in better aligning OFCCP's work with the work of organizations, that is really focused on advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we don't have one set of regulations that may be like contracted out to a third party here, and then sort of another set of programs and initiatives that are separate from that, but are really driving the organization. I'll just share a few observations. One thing that we learned from the harassment task force is that many organizations had kind of settled into what some researchers have termed symbolic compliance, right? It may be out of a lack of knowing what else to do, but well, the courts had found often that if you had a policy that prohibited harassment, a complaint process, and even better if you do some training, that might provide a defense to claims of harassment. And what we saw is that those kinds of superficial or symbolic efforts weren't enough, because they weren't going in to create real accountability mechanisms. And where you had those hard problems with very powerful people within an organization abusing that power, the systems often failed to hold people accountable. And I think what we're seeing now is that the work of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion is hard. Organizations need to be ready for things that may be deeply uncomfortable, but having those difficult conversations and understanding how people across the workforce are experiencing it are absolutely essential to building a stronger workplace on the other side. And it is worth it, right, if done well. And so I think this is the opportunity we have to build that community of practice across so many organizations that are struggling with very similar problems, to be able to share what is working. And for the Asian American community, May is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and often the community has been left out of corporate diversity, equity, inclusion programs. People have assumed that there aren't issues impacting the Asian American community, but there is very strong evidence of many class ceiling issues, for example, in technology. And we see often systemic pay issues at OFCCP in a way that I was actually surprised when I saw some of the data. Since 2019, OFCCP has recovered more than $7 million for over 3,000 ANHPI workers who experience workplace discrimination, often hiring and pay discrimination. But again, it's the kind of discrimination where people often don't know it's happening and they're not filing charges. So having that opportunity to review the data is helping us spot these problems. So I think as we move forward in these efforts to understand how employers can be proactive in creating inclusive cultures, we need to understand how we include everyone in that conversation. And that means people from all racial, ethnic, gender backgrounds, and using this opportunity to understand the role each of us has to play, right, in learning about each other's experiences and understanding how we can create a workplace that removes barriers that have kept some of the talent that can help all of us, right, succeed within our organization. So I think that's the really exciting thing about the time we're in now.
Thank you both. Those are, I think, excellent points, and I think very, very helpful. And it sounds like we're going to be hearing more from both of your agencies on these issues as you move forward. Well, let me turn the discussion to one of the other. There's not just one or two, but one of the other major issues that we all are experiencing. That is, of course, the COVID pandemic, the return to work, and how we are addressing that. Chair Burrows, you convened a hearing, I believe it was April 28th. And why don't we use that as a springboard? I think everyone has had their own personal experience. We all know about the pandemic generally and what the impact has been, but let's talk a little bit about specifically how the agencies are now, where you are and what we can expect in the future. So why don't we start with the hearing that you convened on the 28th?
Sure, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. And let me say, first of all, for everybody in labor and employment, and particularly in the private sector, kudos to you. You should congratulate yourselves for getting through this past year, because it has been unbelievable, as you know. And I don't think, I dare say your predecessors never had to do anything nearly like that. And we at the EEOC have all these issues too. Because we're an employer, not huge, but significant, and we have 53 offices across the country. So we are dealing with the same issues across the board. And honestly, a lot of folks say, we're on 100% telework. I will say that we have continued our work. We're very proud of that, very enthusiastically, everything from the investigation stage all the way through, frankly. We've had at least 2 trials. One was fully virtual, one was in person, and dealt with those things and everything in between. Our mediation program, I think, has been a real eye-opener and a success. It was always wildly popular, but we really have learned how effective you can be with mediation in the virtual space, and really have taken that live, and wherever we can get our surveys out. Some charging parties can't do an online survey, but we've taken pretty much, for those who can, the surveys, the entire process has gone virtual, and we've gotten a lot of successful resolutions that way, and a lot of great feedback. So in terms of our work, that's been the impact. In terms of the hearing, that has been something I've been hoping to do for a year. And it really looked, I want to emphasize this, very broadly. I know all of us are constantly inundated with questions about vaccines and very specific questions. It seems, when we started giving technical assistance, and that's something that we have on our website, and we update it periodically. The question was, can you take a temperature check? Because of course, under the ADA, typically in normal circumstances, when there's not a pandemic, you actually can't administer a check on someone's temperature, because it would be a medical inquiry or exam under the ADA, which is prohibited unless you can show it's job related or consistent with business necessity. So we started, if you can remember that far back, but this hearing was really to focus on writ large on everything and the impact of that from a policy perspective, and to identify those issues that maybe aren't as immediate, but that are coming a bit down the road. You mentioned that a lot of companies that had taken people out of the workplace are now going back in. But I think for employees, it's really been a little bit less than a quarter who actually were able to telework. And for a lot of other folks, they either lost their jobs or they were deemed essential, and so they were on the front lines and really taking risks as to their health. A lot of those jobs were, jobs that did not have a lot of paid sick leave and did not have a lot of flexibility and were not well paid. So we have, sort of 3 pieces of the economy, and in the first 2 groups, those who were furloughed, laid off, and at the same time, those who were deemed essential and had to continue working, they are disproportionately, as I mentioned earlier, people of color, older workers, and a lot of folks with disabilities who are, on the front lines, and incredibly speaking, a lot of women, particularly families with women and families with children. So the impact of that and the implications of that for caregivers, we realize we need to, bring attention again to the EEOC's caregiver guidance, which talks about the ways in which Title VII can actually be implicated by either stereotypes about caregivers or things that have a disparate impact on caregivers. So those are issues that were surfaced. So while, yes, we looked at sort of the immediate issues that I think a lot of your clients are calling you about constantly, regardless of whether you represent plaintiffs or employees or unions, employers or unions, but also looked at the bigger picture and from a macro level, if you will. And I'm happy to say that I do think that we not only learned a lot ourselves, but a lot that we can then use to provide additional help to the public. And we are in the process of finalizing new updates to the EEOC's online COVID-19 technical assistance. So updating this document, as I mentioned, has been an ongoing process. We have to wait to hear what the science is from the public health officials and apply the facts to the law. But I think we can, continue to do that. I know we will continue to do that as circumstances change and our knowledge about the virus and its variants evolve. So I don't want to get ahead of our technical assistance process, but by sort of making any specific announcement, but I can tell you, you should be expecting to see additional updates in that area soon. And I anticipate we'll want to address some of the issues that a lot of you are dealing with around vaccines and some other matters. So we've tried to approach that in a thoughtful manner, and I think that the hearing really was very useful to us in helping advance the ball. And I think that I would really commend to all of you the really excellent testimony that we received from all 12 of the witnesses who were present there. So
let me ask you one quick follow-up question, then I'll move over to Director Yang. Following the hearing, of course, was the CDC's fairly recent announcement on the, I'll call it the latitude and movement in terms of people that are fully vaccinated, which has posed a number of issues in workplaces. Can we anticipate that updated advice or guidance would also recognize and roll that in? Is that sort of deemed to be part of your record that you're looking at?
So I think we are, if we haven't already put a box up on our website saying we're looking at this. It just came out, 2 or 3 days ago, just a few days ago, I guess last week. So yes, we're looking at that. What we're doing though is trying to address issues on a rolling basis. So if you think even back 3 weeks ago, there are issues that have been evolving. So whether or not that'll be the very next thing we put up or not, I don't know that I can say that, but yeah, I think we're looking at all of those and thinking about where it has implications and where we might want to amend what's currently on the website or add some new topics.
Very good. Okay, thanks. So, Director Yang, COVID pandemic. Talk to us a little bit about how how the response is from your perspective, please.
Well, these are really tough issues, and I commend the EEOC and Chair Burrows for their leadership and the very helpful guidance that they've been providing, because it is difficult when the health guidance is changing so quickly to really understand what that means for the workplace. But I think it's also exciting, right, that as we have the opportunity to reopen, that we think through how we make sure that's safe for our workforce and how we balance the important issues of disability, religion, and other issues that come up. And OFCCP in this context is here to listen and learn and be a partner in helping federal contractors navigate some of these challenging issues. And we encourage you also to reach out to us, through our helpline or otherwise, where you have questions, where we can be a resource. I think one of the things I've been thinking about is for our own workplace, as well as the regulated community, how telework will really change our work. Chair Burrows talked some about some of those, the shifts that we've seen, right, in telework. And it's been especially a big issue for many people with disabilities, right? We need to make sure that as people are working remotely, they have access to the tools and technologies they need to succeed. And it's far easier if those systems are designed to truly be accessible. And we've also learned that many jobs can be performed effectively remotely that we might not have anticipated, or many of the functions can be performed quite effectively remotely. So I think that also opens up opportunities for many communities, right? People with disabilities, caregiving responsibilities, but also people with transportation challenges that may not be easily able to access a job if they were required to commute there every day, but might be able to provide significant contributions without that. So telework is also a big topic of discussion for DOL in our leadership, because we've seen how effective our workforce can be while in this maximum telework posture. The agency conducted a telework survey in 2020, and we found that over 60% of our workforce said they prefer to telework all the time or nearly all the time. So we're taking that into serious consideration as we think about how we rebuild and strengthen, because it's also a benefit for the agency if we can reduce our footprint and hire more people, right? So there are various trade-offs that we're considering, and we know that many workers have been able to perform at least some aspects of their job, where it doesn't require an on-site visit. Some things have been deferred, like actually going on-site to workplaces. But I do think that we will see many new forms of work and ways in which people work going towards the future, and I think that will apply to us as an agency as well.
You have plans on your agency's return to work yet? Have you put a timeline down for that yet?
We do not yet. The leadership is working on that, but we don't yet have a date where we're, moving back to in-person work for our agency.
Chair Burrows, same question.
That's the same answer, essentially. We are thinking about that and proceeding, continuing, obviously talking to the union about issues broadly, but there's no date and no set plans to do that anytime soon.
Terrific. Okay. Well, let's pivot to another topic that I know is of great interest to everyone joining us today, and that involves compensation data or pay data. I'll just call it generically. Pay data collection. And maybe Director Yang, maybe I can start with you on this one. Fill us in kind of from the OFCCP perspective on the focus, if there is one, on pay data. I think there is, but my opinion doesn't matter, yours does. If there is a focus on pay data, and maybe pick up if there is coordination with the EEOC or with others relating to those matters.
So thanks, David. OFCCP is very interested in strengthening our work to ensure pay equity. We do have the ability to collect that pay data during the course of our compliance evaluation, and that's an area where we really do see an opportunity to help identify where there may be broader inequities. We also want to develop a more effective neutral scheduling process. That's how we decide which contractors we're going to schedule for a compliance evaluation. And we want to use the data that is available to better identify where there may be problems. And that's why, when I was chair of EEOC and working alongside OFCCP, we moved forward to collect pay data as part of the EO1 Component 2 process. And I'll let Chair Burrows talk more about that effort, but we did believe we needed better information so that we could focus our resources more effectively and understand where problems might exist. So although we're able to collect much more granular data and do more sophisticated analyses as part of our compliance evaluations, there are, sort of the vast number of contractors who we don't have that information from. So I think that's where sort of this broader effort to have some pay data can be very helpful, both in informing the work of federal agencies and also in promoting greater attention to these issues in the employer community. So I've really appreciated the opportunity to collaborate with EEOC on these issues and others. As you may know, and Chair Burrows can talk about more, we do have a new memorandum of understanding that was entered into in the prior administration that we have met with EEOC and DOJ on, and there's really a lot of energy and excitement around opportunities for us to better coordinate, to share information, to work together where we have common interests. So I'm looking forward to that process as well. So I'm happy to turn it over to you, Chair Burrows.
Super. And so
Sure.
maybe, Chair Burrows, you can also give us an update on the National Academy of Sciences effort and make sure that people are aware of, following the initial data collection, sort of what has transpired on that front.
Sure thing. Yes, thank you for that. And I, I will say that we are, very conscious of the fact that it's been nearly 60 years since the Equal Pay Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were signed into law. And yet we continue to see significant and unjustified pay disparities. And for obviously not every disparity is attributable to discrimination or to pay discrimination, but some of them are. And so the pay data collection that Director Yang mentioned was to really collect across 10 job categories based on race, national origin, and sex. And many of you are familiar with it. I know you are, David, because you were very helpful to us as we thought through that process. And I won't attribute anything beyond what the testimony that you gave us to it. So if you don't like the pay data collection, blame me. But
Open recommendations were rejected, but okay.
It was nonetheless very, very helpful. And we had a process by which we were able to authorize that in 2016. It had a little hiccup because it was stayed for a while in the last administration, and eventually a court order held that that stay was unlawful. And we now have collected for 2017 and 2018 pay data from tens of thousands of employers across the country. It was really instructive. We had an excellent contractor to do it out of the University of Chicago, and was just phenomenally successful in the sense that we feel like, and I will not get ahead of the process that the National Academy of Sciences has, but it was a robust collection. It seems to be they're kicking the tires on it, but we will see. It seems that it's going to be very useful to us. So the National Academy of Sciences has a contract to look at the data and provide us some recommendations. And that was something that the commission in 2020, early 2020, so a different composition when there were just three of us, Commissioner Dillon, Commissioner Lipnick, and myself, unanimously decided to have the National Academy of Sciences take a look. Given their gravitas and their expertise, they have we've been very fortunate that they've convened a really top-notch, extremely qualified panel to take a look at it, and that work is proceeding. It's my hope and expectation that we will hear from them at the end of the year as to what their recommendations are. So that is underway. They have had their very first public meeting. They will be having other public meetings. I think the first one was in February, and so I was able to join them to present a bit of the context for the commission's work in this area. But the crux of the issue is really, as Director Yang said, we simply don't have quite enough information to robustly examine how we can best address the issue. We know it's there. We unfortunately find it too often by accident in say a promotions case, or in a case that unwinds in starts off as a harassment case, and then we dig, and it turns out there are other issues that come to light as well. And we find those based on gender, but national origin and color as well. And so it really was something where we thought it would be useful for us to be able to see how best to target our resources. And when I say that, I'm talking not just about enforcement, although that's part of it, but also outreach, understanding broad industry trends, and being able to share that with industry leaders and say, you know, both those leaders that are doing really well, particularly those, and those that aren't, to say, how can we work with you to make sure that this actually is addressed? I think pay discrimination is one of those areas where because we are charge driven so often, people typically, even less than something else, do not know that they've been shortchanged. If they have been a victim of pay discrimination, they're usually one of the last to know. And so if you think about Lilly Ledbetter, for whom the Lilly Ledbetter Act of 2009 was named, you know, she found out because an anonymous note showed up at work, and she'd been on the job making less than the men she was training, right? She was one of the few female supervisors. It'd been going on for like almost 20 years. She had no idea. So we can't rely on charges to reliably help us. And so where do we target the outreach? Who's doing really well in this area? We need to know that too. Tell them, have them help us figure out what's the secret sauce, and maybe recognize them in some ways so that can be emulated. And all of those things are really important. Enforcement is part of that, but we really want to use all our tools in the toolbox. So we don't have any expectation that we will hear from the National Academies of Science before the end of this year, but are very excited that they are taking a look at this and willing to help us with some recommendations.
Can you amplify any further on the MOU and any coordination or efforts between your agency and the OFCCP?
So the Memorandum of Understanding is really designed to facilitate coordination, and where it's practical, to allow us to have maybe joint investigations, or in some cases, OFCCP might actually conduct an investigation of a charge. I would imagine that'd be usually where they are looking more broadly at some pattern and the charge fits there. But the idea is that we can closely coordinate about those things. The Justice Department and OFCCP are both our partners under the MOU. And one of the things that it also allows us to do is to formalize. We can always, of course, pick up the phone and have these conversations, but to formalize the idea that we would talk about emerging issues in the law or trends, and allow not just at the sort of principal level, but also at the level of, you know, sort of more of a, if you will, sort of rank and file across our various field offices as well, so that we can, you know, learn from each other so that our investigations aren't disjointed. I think that will be helpful to employers, in the sense that we, you know, my hope is that we can avoid, if you will, coming at the same problem multiple times with slightly different requests. That's not in anyone's interest, right? So I think that will be helpful in that sense. But we are just beginning, obviously, it's a new administration, to do that. The MOU was initially voted on and drafted in the past administration. And I had some concerns with some of the language, more so, you know, some of the more straightforward things like designations. You know, I think this needs to be rooted at a lower level, for instance, than the Attorney General, who is named, among others, in the MOU as, you know, one of the parties. And so it was things like that, but I think it will be really helpful overall to have that kind of formalized coordination and regular meetings. So I believe that that is publicly available on our website. I'm happy to provide it to the college.
They are available, and I just will make an observation on that. You're right, the MOU isn't new. What is new, though, is having leaders such as yourselves that have experience with the prior agency. So it's much more in your DNA, and you're not naturally siloed, which sometimes can become the personality of agencies. So I personally anticipate there is more likely to be more robust exchange and interchange than there has historically been. And I just put that out for others we'll watch and see what occurs, but that I think may occur.
Yeah, David, one thing I'll add is when I was at EEOC, I know some of our senior leadership said EEOC was working more closely with OFCCP in the Obama administration than they had over like decades combined in prior administration. So I think we have a strong foundation to really build upon so that we can have an even greater impact across our agencies.
And we are very lucky to have Director Yang, who's been at all three agencies and really understands that. I've been at two of the three. So, and I think we at our level, we have a really good partnership with Carlin. And so it will be really useful to have that going forward.
That's going to be an exciting chapter in this administration. Well, let me just from a time check standpoint, programming note, folks, we've got a little under 15 left. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to address those in the time remaining. And I'm going to leave the last 5 minutes or so and ask each of our guests to kind of give their closing thoughts and some sum up points. But in the meantime, I want to ask one or two more questions on pay data. Then let's do one or two other blocks. Chair Burrows, you signed an order in early April, I think it's the 9th of April, addressing, because I think a lot of people don't really know what happens to pay data that gets turned in through the EEO1 process. And it is shared between the two agencies, certainly EEOC and OFCCP. But there's been an issue as to what happens with state agencies, the Fair Employment Practices, or FEPA agencies, as often referred to. Can you just briefly make sure folks are aware of your order from earlier in April?
Sure. I'm delighted that people are interested. It's the kind of thing that I personally think is a little dry, but the order simply returned our agency to what had been a very long-standing practice, really over decades, of sharing the EEO1 under very strict confidentiality provisions and requirements. So we don't share it even just because we have a work sharing agreement with a, we wouldn't just share it with any state or local fair employment practice agencies. You really have to have a work sharing agreement that has the confidentiality provisions in there so that we know it's ironclad. But we had for a long time been sharing with them the EEO1 data for their local jurisdictions, and we are returning to that process. And so the Fair Employment Practices agencies had, in the statute, I should say, Title VII has language that says, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but the word shall share the data is essentially the word shall appears. And we had a longstanding, very successful experience with doing that and had a duty to do so. So the order really just said, and we had ceased doing that in the last administration for some period of months. I would be remiss to say I know exactly for how long, but it was, maybe even as long as a year. And that had generated a lawsuit, which is not that I just put a pin in that separately because, as I mentioned earlier, the statute says thou shall share the data, something like that. Again, it's a paraphrase. But really, it was about making sure that the language of the order was clear as to what could be shared with whom, and that we were able to really, really honor those partnerships the way they had been working so that, everyone had access where they needed it. So that in a nutshell is what we do. And our relationship with the Fair Employment Practices agencies is very important because, as I mentioned at the outset, we have had an expanding jurisdiction, new statutes, and we are thrilled about that. We're thrilled about BOSTAC, but our workload has expanded. Our workforce has not to the same degree. In fact, it's shrunk. So a lot of the work of the commission can be handled by the Fair Employment Practices agencies when they are able to do so. So I think that will be useful, but it was a relatively short period that we were not doing that. And I thought it made sense and was consistent with not just our experience of success in past administrations, Republican and Democratic, but also the statute to go ahead and issue that order. So
return to status quo, basically.
Yes, exactly.
Fair enough. All right. Let's take a couple of minutes and switch gears again. I'll talk briefly about retaliation because I think this fits in. And Director Yang, I think I'll go to you first on this, but I'll just note retaliation. The EEOC does publish, of course, the charge composition, and it continues to be, the leading charge, retaliation, about 56%, I think, in the last full fiscal year data. That's a trend that continues. Disabilities, like 35, 36%, kind of a distant second. And I only put that out there as a data point that retaliation appears to be sort of an overarching challenge, and that's through fiscal year 20. And I'm just wondering, and Director Yang, I'll start with you. From your perspective, how do you see retaliation from the perspective of OFCCP as being a significant issue? You have the unique perspective of contrast and compare a little bit between the two agencies. How do you see it from your current seat?
Well, thanks, David. Retaliation remains a problem for OFCCP as well, even though our focus is much more on these systemic compliance evaluations. We got about 700 complaints in fiscal year 2020, right? That contrasts with what is EEOC at maybe 80,000 or so now complaints a year. I know it's varied some over time, but actually, interestingly, in fiscal year 2020, 56% of all of our complaints at OFCCP also related to retaliation.
Wow.
And it has varied over the years, but it's still a significant percentage of the complaints that we get. And the complaints are really just a small fraction of the problem, right? Because the even, I think, a bigger issue that we don't see is how many concerns of discrimination are never raised within an organization or within a federal agency or state and local, because of concerns with retaliation, right? There are the legal challenges with proving a claim, but there are also just so many practical challenges, right? Because in many workplaces, if you raise a concern, you are branded as a troublemaker, and there's sort of an immediate effort to protect the organization. And I've seen this across all different kinds of organizations, even in those kinds of like nonprofits or socially minded organizations that are actually trying to advance equity. It's this view that we've all sacrificed so hard for this cause, and if you make public this problem, it could undermine us all. It could undermine the mission that we've all sacrificed for. And so it tends to create this pressure that individuals need to, stay silent about problems that might actually be pervasive within an organizational culture. And that's something we really saw with the Me Too movement. And I think what we've learned from that, while I was at Urban, we did a lot of convenings where we brought together employers and workers and researchers to better understand, well, how do we create systems to address this problem? And, part of it is creating a culture that actually encourages people to speak out and raise concerns, right? It's like shifting the norms. And it may not even be formal complaints, but thinking about your structures and your process. so that you create opportunities for individuals to raise concerns in a way that can help the organization get ahead of the problem, right? But that doesn't lead to that retaliation. You know, our system right now requires a worker to essentially publicly accuse often their supervisor or their employer of discrimination against them, right? And that, the research shows, does not end well for workers, right? I've talked to scholars in this field where it's like, based on the research, I would tell any worker never to use the internal grievance process because they have a worse outcome in terms of leaving the organization quicker, in terms of having, you know, various pay problems or lack of promotion opportunities. So one of these events, actually, Camille Olson from Seyfarth spoke. We were looking at tech issues, and she shared that she advises many of her clients that if you really want to prevent retaliation, you need to be tracking the data. You need to look at, well, people who have raised concerns, what is their experience in your organization? Is it taking them longer to promote? Are they leaving at a faster rate? Are they not being assigned to the good projects or being paid less? And I thought that was a really important insight because we have to track it if we want to change the culture, right? Are you having employers highlight in a positive way, right? A manager can say, this concern was brought to my attention. I'm really glad somebody had the courage to raise it. And I want to hear what you have to say. And I'm going to take action to try to better understand and address it, right? And then you check back with the people who raised the concerns and you ask them, how are they doing, right? Have they experienced concerns as a result? But it's an entire mind shift for organizations, right? Not to view a complaint as a threat and as just from a legal compliance standpoint, but really to see it as an opportunity to understand what the concern is and to fix it before it elevates into the kind of legal problem that people are worried about. So I think that what I learned from that Me Too process is there is so much more we can do. I think many leaders, when they do a culture and climate survey, are really surprised to see the very high percentage of their workforce that is not comfortable raising a concern. And that often propels greater efforts to understand how to shift that culture. So I think that's a real opportunity that many organizations
That's a great, very comprehensive sum up of some very effective pointers. Thank you. Chair, I will give you maybe 30 seconds. If you want to add anything to that, then I'm going to give out the CLE code, and I'm going to ask you both in about 60 seconds to do a very short closing statement so we stay on time. So first, anything to add on retaliation?
I would say I agree. It is a very significant problem, and I would stand with my friend Director Yang on all of her comments. So I'll stop there.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you both for that. And I'm just sorry time doesn't allow us to have a more robust discussion on that topic. Let me, for those of you that are interested in continuing legal education or CLE credit for today, the code is as follows: SS9372. Again, it's SS9372. SS9372. All right. With that, I will ask each of our guests to give some closing thoughts in about 60 seconds. I'll start with you, Chair Burrows, and then Director Yang. I will literally give you the last word. So.
Well, I will just say it has been an absolute pleasure to join you all. I am excited to be leading this agency, and I am also excited by the prospect of having conversations. Hopefully one day we'll actually do them in person with those who practice in this area. I would like very much to not have the agency as much as we can be a black box. I would like to hear from you all. Feel free, for instance, if you have suggestions about things like amicus participation, where you think it would be helpful for the Commission's voice to be heard. You should feel free to reach out to us. We have actually a mailbox number, address rather, a web address for that specifically, and that is amicus, amicus@eeoc.gov. Very simple, but I hope very much that this conversation today can be a part of an ongoing dialogue about how the commission can best do its work and fulfill our mission. So thank you, David. Thank you to Director Yang and of course to Susan for that. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Director Yang, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It really has been exciting to be here with you all. I want to thank two of our OFCCP leaders, Tina Williams, who's our policy director, and also Marcus Sturgio, who's our ombuds, who are both here with us today. And I want to say I'm still learning, right, about the work of OFCCP and how we can be most effective, and I'm interested in engaging with you all. I want to highlight that Marcus employs a conflict resolution approach to help facilitate resolution of issues that you might have, and we encourage you to look at our website, to utilize his services. Tina's overseeing our hotline, right, where if you have questions about employer obligations, workers' rights, you can call that hotline or you can ask questions also online. So I just want to end by saying we have incredible opportunity and momentum to make progress on equal opportunity. I look forward to working with the EEOC, Chair Burrows, David Fortney, and all of you as we move forward to deliver that change. So thank you so much for having us today.
Terrific. Thank you. And again, the CLE code is SS9372. I want to thank our two really special guests today. You've really been very generous with your time and insights, and it's been a personal point of privilege to appear with you today. Those fellows in the college, we have a second program tomorrow. I will see if it can even meet the quality of what we've had today, but we'll see. But we do very much appreciate the most senior representatives from the agencies joining and sharing the insights with the practitioners. It is what the college is all about, and we aspire to the highest standards, and having the insights you provided today really help all of us. So thank you and enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.
Same to you. Take care.
Good to see you.